Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Joining Steven and I today for the podcast, he is in Montana. He was the former Montana Fish and Wildlife Commissioner and the chairman of the Fish and Wildlife Commission, roughly between 2007 to 2019. He was part of the guest essay that was written in the Mountain Journal, and we're going to really talk about a lot of things that are happening with wolves in Montana and the hunts that are going on and how those have been affected. Dan Vermillion, pleasure to have you here with us, sir. How is everything going for you?
That's good. Thanks for having me, you guys.
Yeah, our pleasure. Absolutely.
Our pleasure. Thank you for taking me up on the invitation. I contacted a couple of your other guest essay writers as well, and you were the first one to respond. I think really the only one that's given me a yes. So I appreciate you coming out in the forefront. Just please give everyone a background of your time as the wildlife commissioner. What were some of the things that you really strived to do when you were in office? And because you were there for almost 12 years, and that's a long time to be in one position. So what were sort of the things that you were doing as commissioner, and the things you were trying to enact while you were there?
So I got on the commission in 2007, and that was really about the time that the wolf restoration project in Yellowstone and Idaho, and kind of that whole restoration project from the middle to late 90s was really starting to take hold. And it was the time when we were starting to really see declining ungulate populations along the northern side of Yellowstone Park and some pretty site-specific population declines. So at that time, we had a corresponding increase in pressure from certain parts of the Montana public to address the presence of wolves on the landscape. And, as a state commissioner, I was appointed by Democrats. And when I got on there, George Bush was the president. When I left, Donald Trump was. So I was through the 8 years of the Barack Obama administration, also the Bush administration and the Trump administration. And, from a state wildlife perspective and a state commissioner's perspective, our goal really always was to get management of the wolves back into state hands. And, now I would be the first person to tell you that it should go back into federal hands. But the point is that, the whole reason that I thought state management made better sense is for wolves to do well on the landscape, they really need to be tolerated and accepted by the people that live here. And for better or worse, the landscape, as far as the social landscape, Montanans are just, it's not too surprising, are more accustomed to working with state biologists, state wildlife managers, state employees versus U.S. Fish and Wildlife or those sort of employees. So the idea was to get state management over control of the wolves. But to do that, we had to come up with a plan that would satisfy the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to accept or acknowledge that if the wolves came off the list, that Montana could manage them down to or to a level where the population would be secure and sustainable, but also there was reasonable hunting opportunity in places like Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. The first hunt we did was probably in 2009, and I think we set the quota at 75 wolves, and we watched that quota very carefully. And we didn't allow trapping, we didn't allow snaring. It was strictly fair chase hunting operations, no baiting, anything like that. And as soon as we got to 72, and I don't remember how long that took, we shut it down. So we shut it down 3 wolves short of the quota. If you think about like the relisting requirements for wolves, it's 11 breeding pairs in the state of Montana. We had it set up that a hunting season would stop being used if we got to 15 or 16 breeding pairs. So we wanted to make sure that we had that little bit of a cushion. When we made this decision at the time, I believe we had 39 breeding pairs. So we were way, way in excess from depending on your perspective, but from a Montana perspective, we had met the recovery threshold, well exceeded the recovery threshold. And part of that transactional agreement between the feds and the state was that when you get to that point, we will transfer this control back to you. You can manage it, with the understanding that if you got down to 11 breeding pairs or 15 breeding pairs, then you could trigger relisting. So we were very careful in how we managed it, I thought. And obviously we went up over time. Part of that was the legislature forcing us. But you'll remember that like a lot of the big, most aggressive wolf bills that got passed this last session, they've been introduced before in Montana, but we had a Democratic governor who vetoed them. And that was the big difference. So these bills these were not new ideas. They were just ideas that had met the governor's veto pen. And, with Governor Gianforte, he's not vetoing those bills anymore.
I might be skipping ahead here, but on the subject of your new changing, what seems to be a changing opinion about state versus federal management, this is a question I've asked myself probably 100 times now. And I think you were included on an article I was reading about this very topic, but with the, hesitate to use the word extremism, but with the extremism, even just in its presentation of the most recent wolf hunting bill, SB 1211, it seemed all just too obvious to me when I first read it that it may at some point be the very reason that wolves are relisted or even receive special protections, which ultimately means, I guess, a loss of state wildlife management. Why would they risk that? What was so important about the way this bill is presented that was worth the risk of what might be a huge blow to state management?
Well, the Fish and Game commissioners, if you look at it, they've got it set up so if there's a harvest, I think 400 wolves, give or take, then they're going to go back and revisit the quotas. And right now our population is our minimum population, because the only way we can really count them is a minimum. And I think granted, I don't follow this as closely as I used to, but we're at about 850 wolves. So you could, theoretically, if at 400, if you have 400 wolves left, that's still significantly more than the recovery goal. And they theoretically could, they could change the hunting regulations in a way to stave off getting down to that 11 breeding pairs or getting the population. My fear is that with this group of people, I think that really, and this is true all across the West, it's not just Montana, but, I think the big threat that everybody should be thinking about is what happens if we go to if the Endangered Species Act, they get relisted and the states say, buzz off, we're not going to listen. And I don't think that's you would assume that is not realistic, but I would have never guessed in a million years that some of the bills you see coming out of these Western legislatures right now, they are very regressive bills, whether it's wildlife, whether it's COVID, whether it's, it's not just wolves. It's a much bigger anti-federal government movement that I think, wolves are a great lightning rod and they're a great wedge issue, but I think it's bigger than wolves.
Yeah, we've had this discussion multiple times with a lot of people from these states where it really seems as though we're going and regressing backwards to this us versus the federal government, us versus control. We want to have control over the things in our own state because we live here. And there is some part of me that agrees with part of the overreach aspect of it, because people, I think, who live in these states have some at least, have a better understanding of how the interactions between human and wildlife, human and nature are understood, I think, to a degree. You would have a better idea than either myself or Stephen, but why do you think this pendulum, basically, it seems right after you left, or it was maybe heading that way as you were just stating, because there was a Democratic governor there, vetoed a lot of these things. And I'm reading John T. Coleman's book, Vicious, and it's really an eye-opening experience of where we came from. We got to reintroduction and relisting and helping this species get back to where it is now. And now we're going back in the other direction. Why do you think there's such a regression happening and an aggressiveness towards I guess wolves in particular, but it's nothing really against these other species, bears, mountain lions. And I love both those, but
I'll tell you what my theory is, and it's just based on, like, I've watched when I was on the Fish and Game Commission. We were walking, we managed the delisting of wolves through congressional delisting, and managed those wolf hunts throughout the process. And we were always very conscious of making sure that the whole idea is to provide. If you look at, like, if you go to Montana and if you look at when we set quotas for mountain lions. Now, mountain lions scare people, right? And there's really great you can find places where mountain lions have actually killed a runner. You can't find that when it comes to a wolf. So mountain lions, there's community fear, right? And when there's a lot of community fear there, they would come to the commission and say, bump up those quotas. There's too many mountain lions near our schools. The people that would show up to defend the mountain lion and fight against over quotas were the hunters. And the whole idea was, from our perspective, is that if you look at the wolves and you want to breed tolerance and acceptance on the landscape, one of the best ways to do that is, and I don't know how you guys feel about it, is to create hunting opportunity, create consumptive opportunity for hunters, much the way we've done for deer, the way we've done for elk. And that's how we brought a lot of these animals back. And we've really felt like if you had a big enough window and a big enough cushion, you could accomplish building tolerance out on the landscape at the same time you're building a strong and sustainable wolf population. If you look at the grizzly bears, they never went away. So our bears in Montana, they never disappeared. So people have been living with bears at much lower rates for years. When the feds showed up and they brought the wolves back, that was a brand new thing. And it felt like somebody was sticking the wolves on the landscape, even though they have every reason to be here, had been here historically. I think it just, that format was a little different, but I think the bigger issue now is there's very sophisticated political actors looking for wedge issues to actively create political advantage, and wolves are just a great lightning rod.
So speaking of hunting and also on regressing, what do you think this means for the legacy of hunting, at least in the near future? I mean, the negative idea of hunting in the minds of anti-hunting groups is already cemented, I think, mostly by images of certain fringe group hunting methods and events. And this seems like it might be at best less than helpful and sort of a step backwards in the context of public perception that many people and ethical hunting organizations have been working hard to correct. So what does this mean for that?
I think it's a real problem. I think that hunters are going to get a really bad name in this deal. I think the idea that, and this is what my comment to the Fish and Game Commission was a few weeks ago, is like, don't call it hunting if you're baiting at night with lights. That's not hunting. That's extermination. And that is no different than a trap or a snare. Call it that. If you want to call night extermination opportunities, then that's an accurate description, but don't call it hunting. I think it's going to give hunting a really bad name. And I just don't think it's any way to treat these animals. These wolves have every reason to be on the landscape. They've shown very concrete environmental improvement as it relates to water quality in the Lamar, Yellowstone, and all that stuff. So they've it's healthy, it's positive, and it's a much better balance. And, if the rancher out in central Montana sees a wolf and he knows that he can get a tag and go hunt it, he'll probably buy that. But if that rancher sees that wolf out there and he can't get a tag, nobody knows that wolf is out there and he's out in the middle of his pasture and there's nobody around. You tell me what's going to happen to that wolf. So you either regulate the harvest, create opportunities to regulate the harvest, or you say no harvest, in which case, unfortunately, people will take matters into their own hands.
Yeah. And with this, because you just said something that we've heard countless times with this predator specifically, and it cascades down, obviously, and wolves are a big driver for a lot of other species and populations to thrive, both vegetational wise and big ungulates and things of that sort. Where is the translation lost between the science and the information that is coming from people like you in your office that you were there for 12 years, from federal scientists, from state scientists and biologists that are looking at these things and looking at the landscape transforming in a good, positive way? That is it fear? Is it like you said with mountain lions, is it that community that says there are wolves near our schools, and so we're fearful for the kids, even though over the last, I believe, 100 and some odd years, there have maybe been, I think there's been a total of 2 wolf attacks in the entire continent of North America, and I believe they've both been in Alaska. So where is that loss of information and translation coming from?
I think it's, in Montana, you always hear about, you don't as much anymore, but you hear about how the wolves are destroying our elk hunting. The thing to remember about elk hunting in Montana, when wolves showed up in Montana in 1995, we had about 72,000 elk in the state. We're now closing in on 150 to 160,000. So since the time wolves have been here, the elk population in Montana has almost doubled. So, and that's a fact, right? That's just a fact. And so I've relayed that fact at every public meeting space as it relates to fish and game all across Montana in the last 20 years. And it doesn't even register. And I think it's a little bit like, I'm also on the local school board. It's the same mentality of people that will still come in October or November of 2021 after 700,000 people have died of COVID. And they'll tell you COVID's not real, and they'll still have explanations, and they'll believe it. And they're not dumb people. They do a lot of reading, and they just kind of go down. They keep reading something that reinforces something that reinforces something, and they never go outside to look around. And I think if you can figure out why people don't believe the facts about COVID, you'd probably find that there's a lot of similarities with how difficult it is to get people to accept facts about wolves.
So hunters seem to be observing that hunting elk is becoming harder. What can they credit that to? Does it have anything to do with wolves moving elk, et cetera?
Very little. Has to do with drought, climate change, and changing property ownership. And if you look at where all the best elk ranches are in Montana, I shouldn't call them elk ranches that have elk on them, they're very expensive operations to buy. And if you're a rancher who allows people to elk hunt and you just let everybody hunt, your fall is miserable because everybody knows it and they all call. If you just say, well, I'm going to lease it to an outfitter, the outfitter goes in there and leases it to 4 guys, they might shoot their 4 elk out off the property. And then the rest of the season, the elk just come in and they get safe. And so the average hunter who can't get access to that private property, they basically say, God, the hunting sucks. So they all drive around the public lands up on the high country. They see nothing because all the elk are down below in the bottoms. What is the lesson they take away? It's not that, we need to change the distribution of elk so they're accessible to the general public. It's that the wolves ran all the elk down on the lower, down into the valley floors, and that's why there's no more elk. Or they just ate them all. And it's just not true.
Yeah. Is there a mentality that has to change for the hunting community? Or did you see any of that changing when you were still in office? Do you see it now in your life that you have now, in your public life when you're around Montana?
Yes. And we were getting that. I haven't been to the meeting. The whole point of if you're a wildlife commissioner and you want to build sustainability and a stable populations, you have to create respect from the public of the animal, right? You want them to treat it like something I don't know if you guys are hunting, but I covet elk. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. Well, you want people to do the same thing about wolves. And yes, it may be that some people like their idea of a great wolf experience is driving into Lamar, seeing a wolf with her cubs or her pups, what have you. But for somebody else, it may be having an opportunity in the forest at 8,000 feet in November and hunting a wolf. They both love that wolf. And as long as the biological justification behind shooting that wolf is sustainable and it fits into the population growth and management structure that is sustainable, then I think that's totally okay. And I think what you need to do, and I think what the wolf advocates we really need to do is you need to peel those hunters away from that angry group of hunters that all they want is shoot the wolves. You need to find those hunters that are into fair chase, the hunters that are, it's more of a spiritual pursuit than it is a consumptive pursuit, hunting. And those are the folks, and there's a lot of them. They're the ones that we were trying to build bridges with to create the foundation. So we knew that people who came to Fish and Wildlife meetings in Montana, there'd be a strong basis of support for sustainable management of wolves. And you know what? I just, they got drowned out by these angry, most of these guys, if you look at the folks that are pushing a lot of this wolf legislation in Montana, they weren't here 10 years ago. There's changing demographics. We're getting a very different group of people than lived here 10 to 15
Right. I know a lot of guys that I can say that about, that it's more a spiritual pursuit. And if at the very least, it's about food. And they just aren't out making noise. And maybe that's kind of a problem, because there are some folks out there making too much noise, and in some ways speaking for the entire tradition of hunting.
100% true. And it's true in every facet of our lives. I mean, if you look at the number of people who participate in democracy, it's a tiny proportion of the people that are affected by the bad decisions that politicians make.
What was the tipping point for you and your former colleagues who were commissioners and things of that to really pen this essay and put your voices out there? Because to me, in the state that you're in the part of the country that you're in, it's a bold move, and I commend you for it, because I think more people like you need to share their voice. Who have, I mean, you were frontline for over a decade to have this really big balance act of trying to deal with public perception and what's going on actually biologically. What was the tipping point for you to say, we need to have our voices heard, we need to pen this essay and show how we actually feel about this?
Oh, I think the tipping point was, when Governor Gianforte was elected, we all were concerned. And when he got inaugurated, we were more concerned. And then when these bills started coming in, it was really terrifying. I mean, I know, and if you look at like the trapping statistics for Idaho and Montana, Idaho has more wolves, and they've allowed snares for at least since 2011 or 12, whenever it was delisted. And Montana has not. And if you look at the trapping success and the trapping numbers in Montana versus Idaho, they would only get 2 or 3 more wolves every year by allowing snares. But but we decided we're not going to put snares on public lands for a variety of reasons. A, it's terrible on dogs. I mean, it's not a survivable situation. But more importantly, or I guess I shouldn't say more importantly, but of equal importance is the bycatch. So if you think about snares, and if we're worried about wolves and we're worried about all these young animals not being able to get to maturity and build the population, well, then snares kill more bycatch than they do actual prey. So, that's what all the studies show. So, at some point, it doesn't become about science. It becomes about politics. And if you are pushing proposals that don't accomplish your goal, but of actual getting a certain type of harvest, but do accomplish your goal of stirring up the population, well, then that to me is about politics. And I really feel that night hunting with bait on private land, on the lands adjoining Yellowstone Park, that to me is just a recipe for, abuse. And unfortunately, it's going to be grizzly bears, it's going to be wolves. It's not going to be good for the wildlife. And I'm in the tourism business. And, if the tourism business, we depend on non-residents coming here to visit us, and non-residents have choices. So, I guess fortunately for Montana in this case, you'd be hard pressed to decide who's worse, Montana, Wyoming, or Idaho. So if you want to go to the Northern Rockies, you got to come to one of us. But the bottom line is, Montana's done very well by managing its fish and wildlife in a way that I think was the envy of the United States and the world. And it just breaks my heart for my children and for future generations of Montanans and people around the country that they're not going to be able to come to Montana and enjoy the same sort of natural abundance that we all have. And, I think it's criminal, and it's just disturbing as hell. So that's why we wrote it.
Yeah, I used to refer to Montana that way, just like as the place that kind of did it right. We have Montana has the host of the full host of natural predators as far back as is, I guess, meaningful to the prey species that is on the landscape. And it is such a shame because I never lived there. I used to visit a lot. I love Montana. And I used to, you know, I don't know. I used to think a certain way about it and add it into conversation in such a way that would portray it as this place that did it right.
Shows it can work.
I guess what needed to be maintained. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, because Montana has a very healthy economy. We have for years. Tourism's done well. Ranching and agriculture and farming has done pretty darn well. We have an oil and gas industry. Are there things I'd like to see differently in a lot of industries? You bet. But we had a good balance. And, if you live in Montana as a Democrat, which I have my whole life, you kind of have to realize you're not going to get everything you want. And forever, Montana, if you look at Montana's constitution, we have the strongest state constitution in the United States. We have a stronger right of privacy than the federal constitution. We have the only constitution that I'm aware of that guarantees Montanans the right to a clean and healthful environment in its preamble. So, we have a constitution that is rock solid, but the only way you keep that constitution intact is by a Supreme Court that's really strong and balance in the Montana legislature. Well, balance has left the legislature. The only thing we have left is a Supreme Court. And who knows how long that'll last. Because we've lost it. As Democrats, we've lost every single election that was meaningful in the last 4 years.
It's really incredible to me that it's come down to politics and really about feeding to the I don't want to say the lesser, but the extreme parts of ourselves. I think all three of us can agree that wolves, for whatever the reason, are the embodiment of who I think we are as human beings, because we look at them, we built our family structure off them. We see so many things, I think, emotionally, physically, familially, that are similar. And it just strikes me that there's so much animosity on both ends to our fellow man, for one, and the wolves are really caught in the middle about this. And to your point about the tourism aspect of it, we spoke with a couple people, and it's not as though the tourism is a small aspect of Montana's
the second largest
economy.
It
is a huge, right? It's giant. And for that to be put in jeopardy, I think again goes to Stephen's point that he asked you earlier. How is it a short-sighted look, or is it just are the blinders on and no one really takes that into account? What do you think?
It's definitely short-sighted. I think it really comes down to almost cultural warfare, and they look at the tourism industry as being primarily Democrats, and they look at the hunting industry as being Republican. They look at the ranching industry as being Republican, and that's their people. And they don't look at those of us in the non-consumptive. And we've worked really hard here to try to reach out to hunters and say, look, just because you think you should be able to carry a pistol into the grocery store, don't carry that into, if you carry that sort of approach to wildlife policy, you're not going to have wildlife. And any wildlife that you have is going to be on a private piece of property, and you're going to have no access to it. So, I come at it from the hunter's perspective for sure. And I really do believe that, balance is so much more sustainable than wild pendulum swings. And, in this state, we are in the middle of a wild pendulum swing to the right. And I just don't know how long it's going to last. When I left the commission, I thought there was no way the wolves were ever going to have to be a concern again. I just didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
It is.
I mean, what did you do with your time there that you were able to, because you talked about, again, you had a Democratic governor. What was obviously your challenges are to keep the balance, but what were some of the tactics, or what are some of the things that you did? Was it outreach? Was it information? Was it boots on the ground? You were there. What was the thing that you felt worked best for you, for your cabinet, the people that were working around you, that made it so that 12-year period was, it seemed, largely balanced?
Yeah, no, I would say that really came from the top. I think if you look at the first Democratic governor I worked under, Brian Schweitzer, or you look at the second one, Steve Bullock, they were both very clear that they wanted to get the state to a position where it could manage its wildlife. And they knew and they believed in the balance between federal and state wildlife management systems, that the only way that the state should be entitled to manage those sort of those sorts of wildlife, or as if we can do it in a way that's sustainable and doesn't run afoul of the Endangered Species Act. So it was really about, from the very beginning, a commitment to have a hunting season as soon as we could do one sustainable. And the underlying belief there was really about creating tolerance, because we have to create tolerance on the landscape, because these wolves spend a lot of time in very dangerous places if you're a wolf. And if you have people who don't respect or don't feel listened to, and they've got a gun in the back of their truck and they see a wolf out in the prairie and there's nobody around, they just feel like if that wolf gets her, he's here forever. You know what? They're going to take care of it. And that may not be right. It isn't right, but that's just a fact, is how it plays out. And so creating, I always think about it as sometimes the balloon gets really tight and you got to let some air out. And every now and then you've got to let a little bit of air out of the balloon so it doesn't pop and they go completely crazy. And, if you look at Montana's elk wolf harvest, every single year it's gone up. So it's not as though we're curtailing the harvest. The harvest is growing, but so is the balance is working. The numbers are still there. And now, that balance, when you get 10 people shooting, well, if you can get 10 wolves and you can snare them, they can be vulnerable. I still don't think you can exterminate them without poison, but I wouldn't put that past this bunch of legislators either.
I think that's an important thing that you mentioned there is groups of people who do not feel like they're being listened to. This kind of becomes the last resort. Say more about what you mean by that, them folks not being listened to.
Well, I think it's more just, if they have this, when the state is managing the wolf population, if they have a problem, every single county in Montana has a local game warden and a local biologist that deals with the ranchers and the outfitters and the hunters and the fishermen. They're out they're sort of our liaison on the ground, right? Trying to, provide that information, make sure that the people that live there know what the department's trying to accomplish, but also hearing from the landowners and different stakeholders about what's going right and what they feel is not going right. And so we've got a really, really in-depth and very comprehensive system that as a fish and game commissioner, when I was a commissioner for Southwestern Montana, I was on the phone 10 hours a week with people about issues they were having with wolves or bears or elk or antelope or whatever. And so that is what I talk about, making them feel heard. They need an outlet. They need to be able to reach out to somebody. When you get it to the federal level and it's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officer that's in Denver and you're up in Conrad, Montana, that connection is broken. And that, even if the guy from Denver is super responsive, it's not the guy whose kids go to the same high school as my kids. And that makes a difference. It's a constant battle. And trying to make it, and a lot of times when they don't feel listened to, it's just because they're not recognizing when they're being listened to. If they don't agree with what you do, sometimes they think you didn't listen to them. It's not that I didn't listen to you, but I just for whatever reason, decided to vote in a different direction. And that's what democracy is about, right? And the population, I guess, the voters at some point said, hey, we've had enough. I don't think they voted on wolves. They voted on a whole host of other issues. But nonetheless, they didn't, a lot of these legislators don't even know they've never seen a wolf. But, they're not going to stand up and oppose the guy from Northwestern Montana who's in their party who really feels like the wolf population in the Superior Valley is not where it should be.
I wonder if this is one of those things. I'm trying to remember who we're talking to. I think it was Mark Cook, Wolves of the Rockies. I'm pretty sure it was him. And he was able to take some of these individuals who had, I think they were ranchers, maybe even hunters at the time, and he was able to organize a trip to get them to Yellowstone so they could actually
my buddy was on that trip. He said it was
wolves
awesome.
in the wild. Yeah. So, and it was just, it seemed from Mark's perspective, just how viewing, seeing, hearing these predators in their natural environment and understanding that this is their place on the landscape. Not to say that it's going to change everybody's mind, but I wonder if that's something that needs to be talked about more, to have really these interactive experiences, these trips, something that can try and bridge the divide between, as you say, and I know it's so polarizing in some of these Western states where it's, like you said, tourism is Democrat and hunter cattle ranching is Republican or whatever it is. But to bring these two groups together and say, hey, we can actually help each other. And this is the really the Eden or the grand thing that we're promoting and saying, hey, look at what we have in our backyard. And this is a lot of the reason why these people come here. And it's all walks of life. It's not just, Democrat, Republican. It's people from all over the place. I just wonder if that's an option or a way to bridge the gap.
That's one of the things that Mark Cook does as well as anybody. I mean, Mark Cook, and the reason I respect him as much as I do is that, even when we had a Democratic commission, so to speak, for the 12 years I was up there, we very rarely gave Mark what he wanted. Very rarely did we vote in a way that Mark went home that night and said, dang, that's a good commission. There were several times that I took votes that I'd have to go to Mark afterwards, like, look, Mark, I'm really sorry. My heart's with you, but I just don't think that's the smart move right now from a policy standpoint for keeping wolves in a safe place. And the good thing about Mark is he always got that. And he respected differing points of view because he knew he felt comfortable, I believe, that we listened to him, that we respected what he was saying, even if we didn't agree. Unfortunately, a lot of the folks on the other side, they don't have that same level of, I don't know. They just have a different approach. And it's, I think it's really too bad. I think that you got to do the outreach. The thing that we always talked about was the way you keep the wolves off the list is cooperating together, whether you're a hunter, a wolf lover, whatever. We all want state management. So the way we do this is manage these wolves at a sustainable level. And, we have a pretty good rule in Montana where if you see a wolf eating your cow, you can shoot that wolf. That doesn't, as soon as they're back on the list, that's gone, right? We can't do that. You'd have to go get the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So that rancher has lost an incredible amount of flexibility to protect his herd. Now, they will probably still protect their herd, but they will be breaking the law whereas now, Senate Bill 200, they could go get a permit, they could get a license. And I think we set up to a quote of about 100 wolves a year that could be harvested to protect cows, sheep by the ranchers. And we only did the quotas in 25 wolf increments. We never got above 10 or 12 wolves. So we never had to go to that second batch of quota 25 to 50. We just did 0 to 12, 25. So the point was we were allowing 12 wolves or whatever to be harvested by these ranchers who felt their property was being threatened, offensive to some, but it gave those folks the belief, and I think it's a completely rational belief, that look, they had the tools to protect their property, protect their business, and they could do it legally, right? When you put those wolves back on the list, it gets very hard to do that legally in a timely way. You can do it, but you got to call somebody, they got to drive out. It's just not the same. And so, I think these wolf regulations that the Republicans have put in here in Montana have really neutralized or disempowered or disenfranchised the very constituents they're trying to help. Montanans have fewer options for managing wolves now than they did before. That is if they go on the list. If they don't go on the list and they stay off the list, well, then it's a wholesale slaughter. But they go back on the list, and Montanans have lost a lot. And honestly, we have nobody but ourselves to blame.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that about the black eye that some people have mentioned here about the state of Montana and what this is really saying to the rest of the country. That, again, we spoke about the beacon that Montana was with the reintroduction and the natural, all the beauty and the naturalness that was in Montana. And now that there might be this dark cloud or this black eye that's starting to form over the state, What do you see out in your personal life with the people you interact with? How is this? Is it really split down the middle 50-50?
That's an interesting question, but I would tell you that when I first got on the Fish and Game Commission, all anybody wanted to talk to me about was wolves. And probably about 2012, 2013, when we first started doing wolf regulations in Montana, it was an all-day affair, and we would have 150 people wanting to testify. Towards the end, it would take us 5 minutes because the public had bought in and supported what we were doing to such a degree that the system was working. It took us 5 minutes. And now, like all that work to build tolerance, to create a place for them on the landscape, it took a lot of time. And I had some very scary conversations. I had security on several occasions. I had websites with targets on my forehead. And, it took it was hard, but I think we got it there. And I thought the wolves, they were in a great place, and they're not anymore. And, I don't think this is a blip. That's the other thing that makes me really sad is I think, I had hoped that Donald Trump was going to be the high water mark of crazy in 2016, but that's not really the case. And we keep seemingly in this country and in this state being able to redefine the outer edges of crazy and what is acceptable. And stuff that is being introduced as legislation right now, 10 years ago, people would have just been like, can you believe it? Nobody, and now it barely bats an eye. So I'm not very optimistic about the future, to be honest with you, for Montana. I think Montana, we are very blessed in that we have a big state with very few people. And I think much like the Endangered Species Act did once before, of bringing things like wolves and grizzly bears back from the verge of extinction, unfortunately, Montana and Wyoming and Idaho are doing their level-headed best to kind of take us back to where we were in 1995 or 6. And, that's really unfortunate. It's worse than unfortunate. It's devastatingly angering. It really pisses me off beyond belief.
I wonder what that was like for you too, because you going back a few statements ago, when we're talking about Mark and you're making these policy decisions, I can't imagine the back and forth going on between your feeling and what you feel is going to be right policy wise for you to make some of the decisions I'm sure you had to make in those 12 years. How did you manage that for yourself? Because I feel you, and I feel the passion you have for your state because of the service that you gave and everything that you're still doing right now. How did you manage that within yourself to be able to separate those things and make those policy decisions so that, like you said, you built this tolerance up until it's under attack right now?
I think there were just, it was really from the department. I didn't become a commissioner a lot of what I'm talking about is stuff I learned on the job, I was a fishing, I loved to hunt and fish. I grew up here. I run a fishing and hunting business. So, that's just kind of that was why I became a fish and game commissioner. But, Montana very quickly, there was sort of a culture there where you learned about the first meeting you go to, first introduction you have is talking about the North American model and talking about the importance of public ownership of wildlife. So there was a real cultural, it's our third rail in Montana. If you look at what's going on with landowner tags right now in Montana, it is our third rail, and everybody says we don't want to be Colorado or New Mexico. And so, when I was trying to make the right decisions, it was all about trying to figure out a way to I want to see wolves in Montana. I want to see grizzly bears in Montana. I want to see bison in Montana. But I guess it's more about, you can't just wave a wand and say, we're going to bring bison back or we're going to bring bears back and then leave. It is a huge, for these animals to exist and to survive, they can do it in Yellowstone Park because they're protected, right? But as soon as they come out of the park, which inevitably they will have to, unless you want to just limit the population to whatever the carrying capacity is for Yellowstone, eventually they're going to come out into places where they're not so safe. And I really felt like if the wolves can't leave and the bears can't leave Yellowstone and be reasonably safe, all we're doing is staving off their extermination. We're not preventing it. And you need to give them a living landscape. And the only way you can give them a living landscape is with people on it. And if you're going to have people and big carnivores on a living landscape, you have to figure out a way for them to live together. Otherwise, you get these huge pendulum swings. And so that was the idea, is like, we manage wolves like this, not like this for a steep growth, steady growth. And then you get to a level where whatever that level is, and I don't know the number, or that's up to the biologist, but you get to a place where things are in balance. The cattlemen are not losing too many cows. The sheep aren't losing too many sheep. Elk hunting is good. The wolves are, doing their thing. The bears, there's a balance there. But you don't find that balance by just getting rid of two species like wolves and bears. That's not balance. That's what we had before when you had 24,000 elk of the northern Yellowstone elk herd. And when we had a thunderstorm in the Lamar, the Yellowstone went out for 4 days. Now it goes out for 20 minutes or 40 minutes. We get pulses of mud, but we don't get 5 days of mud. So, there's a lot of things, I believe that's because the wolves have moved the elk out of the bottoms and the willows have come back. I'm not a scientist, but that's just how I see it.
Wow. From an outsider's perspective on a different state, what's your hope for Colorado? Because we're going to be, I believe, close to a year now, because we're going to be hitting, I can't believe we're going to be in 2022 shortly.
Wasn't that on your ballot in Colorado today to reintroduce wolves?
That already happened, and it passed. Yeah.
It passed. So they passed that ballot initiative. So they are going to reintroduce wolves. They're getting a plan together. That was last year. Yeah. Yeah. So by 2023, they're going to have a management plan, a reintroduction plan, everything in place to relocate I don't know where they're getting the wolves from or what they're doing yet. It hasn't been released, but they're going to drop them off on the western slope.
Well, I would tell you one thing they shouldn't do is don't get wolves from British Columbia, because that's all we hear about is how those are big Canadian wolves instead of, so you got to make sure you get some wolves that are sort of American wolves. And then the other thing you need to think about is, when I read about what's going on in Colorado, it's very clear that you've got places like Denver and Boulder that are 80% of the population. They're all pro-wolf. Then you go to places like Grand Junction in the northwestern part of the state, and they're more like Wyoming or Montana. And again, it'll be really easy to pass. It'll be really easy to get the money together to do it. But where are you going to put those wolves? You're going to be putting them into communities where there may or may not be adequate tolerance. So I'd be looking really hard at how are you going to allow the wolves to not necessarily prosper.
It's just a reality.
But at least survive, in those landscapes. So that's, they're going to face a lot of the same challenges. But, you just got to make sure that the ranchers feel like they have an escape valve. They have a way to deal with a quote unquote problem wolf, and that whoever is responding to livestock kills is super responsive. And, like here in Montana, Defenders of Wildlife put in about, I don't know, $600,000. So every time a rancher lost a cow to a wolf, and if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said, maybe we couldn't get there in time to verify that it's a wolf kill, there have been wolves eating it, but we can't guarantee that it killed it. Defenders stepped in and wrote a check. And that is how you it's money, and it's, maybe you shouldn't have to write a check to these people, but sometimes writing a check for $1,000 for a cow is way cheaper than having to go through another 6 months of angry protests. Don't be cheap on the front end as far as compensation for loss. Even if you don't feel like they should be compensated, make sure they feel like you're listening.
Yeah. There's so many different things. It's such a tangled web of politics and science and biology and feelings and emotions. And it's going to be interesting to see. We spoke with Mike Phillips, and I know Mike is driving this and doing such a fantastic job of trying to make sure that everybody is heard, all the information's out there. And, once this gets, I think, under the year mark, we'll try and reach back out and see how that process is going. But I agree with you. I think as long as everybody is heard and there are parts put in place where people can call, they can talk, they can get these issues resolved as efficiently and justly, I think, as possible, that will alleviate, like you said, the air on the balloon hopefully won't get too tight and it'll stay, it'll have that room to grow, like ebb and flow a little bit, and people will be able to manage this in a good way.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think if you look at like the way Colorado, I mean, if you look at like Boulder, Denver as it relates to say Grand Junction, it's not that different than the way Los Angeles and New York City relate to the Rocky Mountain West, right? And you've got these distinctions, you've got these very different perspectives that you need to figure out a way to find space for on the landscape. And, the strongest wolf proponent from Vermont is not going to hold a candle to, a ranch grandmother who lost her calf, her 4-H calf, to a wolf. And that's what you're dealing with. Even though it's just one little calf and the calf is $350 or whatever, there's a lot more to it. So just even when you're right, be sympathetic and as compassionate and as understanding as you can possibly appear.
Agreed 100%.
Yeah.
And understand that, you're asking them to change, and people don't like it, and none of us like it, even though when changes, some changes just have to happen. But it's all about how you sell it and trying to make sure it doesn't feel like it's shoved down anyone's throats.
Yeah. This is my last question, John. So then you can, wrap up if you want. This part of the conversation does make me wonder, because I do know some folks some people who I trust who have allegedly confirmed sightings of wolves in the San Juans. And I'm wondering what would have been the difference had we just let them populate on their own in terms of protections versus reintroducing them.
So if you look at the grandfather of wolf reintroduction in Montana, it was a guy that was on the Fish and Game Commission with me by the name of Bob Ream. He was a professor at University of Montana's Wildlife Management Institute. He started it, and he did all the first studies on the wolves when he was teaching at U of M in the 70s and 80s. He was the guy that was going up into the Yak and up the Upper Flathead and trying to find signs of wolves. And basically, and he was on the Fish and Game Commission. And when he got on the commission, I asked him, he said, the biggest mistake he thought that we made on the wolf issue was having the federal government get in front of a natural repopulation of the landscape. So the feds, we had wolves moving down from Canada, coming through the Flathead. They'd gotten down to like Augusta, the Great Falls area. And that was like 1995 or so. Then we brought all those wolves in. I shouldn't say all those wolves, but we brought the wolves into Yellowstone and into Idaho. And suddenly everybody was pissed off about the wolves up in these naturally recurring wolves that had just been quietly moving down on their own, protected by the ESA. They were establishing a stranglehold and people were thrilled by them, right? And now suddenly when they were thrilled to see wolf, and then when the government got involved and put the wolves on the landscape, it happened too quickly for a lot of people. On the other hand, and so that's what he believed. And he was as strong a wolf advocate as you'll ever find, but he felt like we couldn't get the tolerance caught up to the population growth. And if you go slowly, tolerance grows as the population grows. But if the population grows like this, the people have to make a pretty big jump to catch up. And, you can't force that jump to happen. They'd have to do it on their own.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a very valid question. We might have waited 50 more years though, too. So who knows, honestly.
Yeah. The course of history would have absolutely been changed in that way, but hindsight's 2020. You never know. Two things for you, Dan. I'll ask my last question after this, but what are you actively doing at the moment? I know you have your own business and you're retired from the Wildlife Commission. So where can people turn to you? Can they contact you? Is there stuff that you're promoting that people can be informed, or how can they be informed about what's going on in Montana?
No, I think that they're welcome to contact I mean, my next deal is probably running for the state legislature next year here in Livingston, and it's a seat that I can win. The only way we change this, I mean, you can create tolerance on the landscape, and that's super important. But the other way is, we all thought, like, if I had $1 for every time I asked myself, why would hunters vote that way? I don't understand why hunters consistently vote for the party that deprives them of access and of meaningful hunting opportunities, but they do. And so understanding why I feel like we're on the right side of history unequivocally, but this is a hard time, and we need to figure out, for the animals' sake, if nothing else, is how do we turn this around quickly? And politics and legislative, getting involved and being in a position to make decisions, that's how we do it. And I think it's really important. I mean, look at the U.S. Senate. If it wasn't for everybody's all upset with Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, right? If you're a Democrat. But without those two, Mitch McConnell's the majority leader. So, it's a really tricky balance right now. And if you're trying to push moderate or progressive policies, it's hard. And, wolf reintroduction is not a moderate policy. It's a little further to the left there. And so it's harder than it's ever been, I think.
We need more people like you. I think you're right there. You're in it. And speaking for myself, I can't thank you enough for all the things that you have done and now you're looking to do. So again, thank you for being a voice of reason and a voice of advocacy and everything else that you are trying to change in Montana. So I appreciate you and all that you're continuing to do. My final question for you is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Well, I mean, for me, it's really about it's the same thing. Like, imagine looking on a beautiful river and there's no fish. It's like, I look at a river without fish, and I mean, I'm a fisherman. To me, a river without fish is a lot less interesting. The same thing with any landscape. I mean, one of the things that makes Montana interesting to me is, and this is only in the intellectual sense, is there's stuff out there that can eat me. I think, there's a reason all these puzzle pieces fit together. And I don't understand why we wouldn't want the complete puzzle put together rather than several huge pieces missing. And for me, wolves are supposed to be here. They create balance. You've got CWD now, you've got different diseases coming into our ungulate herds. Wolves can play an important role there. And most importantly, they're just, they were here before us and they should be here after us.
Well put. Dan Vermillion, again, this was terrific. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for just being you and getting out in the forefront, my friend. You're fantastic. It's a pleasure to meet you, and, just keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's nice to meet both of you guys too.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Terrific.
much.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work. And if you see Mark, say hello to him for me.
I will.
Absolutely.
And if you're driving north of Yellowstone, our office is right on the road.
Oh, amazing.
So,
We're going to have to stop by.
Come on by.
We will. Absolutely.
Please do.
Absolutely.
All right. Have fun, you guys. And thanks a lot.
No problem, Dan.
Take care.
You take care as well. House to everybody out there. Yep. And we'll talk to you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the donate tab, and find out more information.